a quick intro of myself, Stephen Scott. I'm one of the practice directors here in BSI. I look after an area called digital risk advisory. As I mentioned in previous webinars, I have a kind of a mix of experience. So I would say approximately 11 to 12 years in professional services consulting. And then I've about 10 years in financial banking across 3 different banks. So I'm going to try bring a little bit of both into the conversation. Yeah, so that's me. Because we're going to be talking a lot during this. So
excellent. And let's move over to Paul.
Yeah, hi. I've been with BSI for 10 years now. I'm a practice manager working under Stephen Scott's team. I'm also a principal consultant, so still getting my hands dirty. Still getting out there, trying to balance the management and the practice at the same time, and mainly working with government, the Ministry of Defence, and in industry. So a good balance across all areas of cybersecurity and security in general, really. Conor, over to you.
Paul, pleasure to be here, and thanks indeed, Craig. I am also working with BSI, as it happens. I've been here about 7 years now at this point, and I've spent most of my career, in fact, it's actually all of it, in professional services, advising clients one way or another on security, privacy, data protection, risk, and everything else in between. And my career has sort of spanned financial services, public sector, technology, and for the last number of years I have been leading our outsourced DPO services in BSI Consulting, and more recently I've moved into a commercial go-to-market architect role, so helping Stephen, Paul, and the wider consulting teams and our clients figure out what not necessarily what they need for compliance today, but actually what they might need to do for compliance in the future. And I think we'll probably get to talk a lot about that today as well. So pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. Thanks to all of you. And like you mentioned, we are here to talk about the evolution of compliance.
Yeah.
So let's, just walk us through, each of you, what you think about that topic and what you've seen evolve over the course of your career. Let's go ahead and start with Paul for this one.
Yeah, sure. So my background, I spent a lot of time in the military, in the Royal Air Force Police, specializing in counterintelligence and physical security. And I think for me, that was a really good building block, because everything within that is still valid today in everything we do in the cybersecurity world that we used to do in the physical security world. I find this really useful when I go and speak, because most companies, a client will come up to the board or someone within the company and say, "Oh, we need to get, you need to be 27001 for us to do business with you." So the company will say, "Oh, right." Okay. The board will say, "Yeah, okay, well that's obviously an IT function, so let's give it to IT, and they can organize all this and get it all sorted." So where I come from, normally when I come in there, I'll go back to my roots, looking at the physical security work, and I'll try and relay to the board that, where I started from, we'll perhaps say we're looking in a room, and in the room there is a file on the table, and it's maybe the board expenses, how much their new curtains cost in the office and everything else. So the board doesn't really want that document, getting out there, for the rest of the company to make jokes about them. So this file's sitting on a desk in a room. Is the door locked? Do we have a key for the door? So we're looking at protecting that document at rest where it sits. Is the door going to be? Is the room going to be locked with a key? So we're implementing access control. Who will use the key? So we're talking about vetting. Is that person within a group that's going to access it? So they get down to a security group. Have they got authorization to access the key? Does he sign for the key? So is there logging involved? And I try and relate all these things, not going anywhere near IT, just to get them to understand that, everybody's got an information security management system, but it depends how good that is. And to think about, it's the information that you need to concentrate on, not the IT function that supports the business. So from my point of view, going through that physical security thing, thinking about the information is what we are there to protect, and going on, and then sort of finally talking to the board about, okay, you know, it's your strategy, it's your approach that is going to shape this within the company, so that the IT function feeds off what you tell it. So for me, you know, that early stages of physical security paints the whole picture for how we've now evolved to, you know, just crossing over those values into cyber. And that was it for me.
Yeah, it's a great point. Is it's you know, while some of the tools may have changed over the years, obviously, you know, the fundamentals are still there. So it's still simple, talking about the same things. Scott, over to you.
Yeah. So I think even just as a slight background as well, thinking about where did the idea for the webinar came up. It's just we've been as you might in a professional services company, you're like, well, what's the next hot topic? And we just saw such a level of change going on in I suppose, with standards, frameworks, regulation coming out. We thought we'd wrap it all together into one kind of topic, right? So I think as we go through this, we're going to touch on a variety of different standards and frameworks. But I was going back to when we were doing a little bit of prep for this, I was kind of thinking back, well, I started my career in 99 in banking. I worked in invoice discounting, and the concept of security or privacy for me was non-existent, right? It was actually, if you even mentioned security, someone would probably fall asleep. You know, it just was a non-runner. There was no security or privacy by design. I went off then and did a bit of a degree in IT, did things a bit backwards. But again, there was one of the subjects in my course was security, and it kind of struck my interest. And I think the lecturer actually who went through it had a bit of industry knowledge, and I think he worked in that kind of space. So to be honest, it was probably the only lecturer who actually worked in industry. I went back into, after college, I went back into kind of Allied Irish Bank as it was then, and I joined an assurance team. I think I was pretty lucky, if I'm being honest, because it was a second line defense function that spanned or covered a lot of very, very, to me at the time, interesting topics. So we had a kind of a management of IT risk, so we kind of governed it. We also looked around regulatory compliance, and that had a variety of different impacts. And then additionally, we did audit tracking for internal audit.
You know, interesting there, where what you do tend to see in regulation evolution, I think, is that something happens and then the regulators come in and have to then decide to say, hey, maybe I need to do something about that. So yeah, if anyone out there isn't familiar with the Enron story, there's a couple of really good movies out there and documentaries about that. So definitely something to take a look at if you're not familiar, and learn from that. So let's go over to you, Conor, and let us know what you've seen around that evolution.
Yeah, well, I think, Craig, what resonated with Scotty's words there was sort of the origins of my career was very much on the other side of maybe what Scotty has experienced. And I think, you know, for me, when I started back in IT audit in professional services organization, it was mid financial crash. So, you know, late 2000s, and compliance was primarily focused on ensuring adherence to regulatory requirements. At that time, I would argue, whether that was internal audits, you know, to you know, Institute of Internal Audit requirements, agreed international standards, or also external financial audits and financial control checks, just like Scotty was alluding to there with Sarbanes-Oxley and the origination of maybe third-party assurance and attestation reports like SSAE 16, ISAE 3402 in Europe. And my early experiences of compliance, you know, involved conducting things like IT audit control checks as part of external IT audit engagement. And that was very rudimentary, simple access control lists and, you know, application control checks, but all with the view of giving financial auditors assurance over the IT control environment, which is very novel for them as well, like also evaluating controls, assessing risks relating to IT and IT general controls. Right across different sectors though, public sector very heavily, utilities, heavily regulated sectors like financial services as well. And I think really it sort of the introduction to compliance through regulation really emphasized the importance of effectiveness of control design, and indeed effectiveness of control implementation, and with a specific focus on that financial reporting element that Scotty was alluding to.
Sorry,
but,
my internet just went there. Apologies.
I had a power failure. I had a power failure right before
Yeah.
webinar
It's
as
obviously
so
going
it's
to
all
happen
going
during
on.
the webinar.
But I think what really resonates with me in terms of like where we've started, or where I was introduced to compliance, was it was compliance against something because somebody said so. It was that sort of like, here's the stick, as opposed to the carrot approach, which I most definitely favor at this point of my career, having worked through, you know, financial crashes and bank bailouts and austerity and dot-com booms and busts, and now the advent of further regulation, further agreed international standards, but critically then the evolution of technology and the role that technology now plays, not just in compliance, but in the creating the environment within which compliance is an acute focus for most organizations today. So I think what I've seen most definitely over my career to date is a very significant evolution from checking it because somebody said you have to check it, to a much more mature approach to actually, this is something that we can do, not because somebody said so, or there's a piece of law that says so, or regulation, which is obviously, you know, fundamentally compliance risk 101, breaking the law, right? But at the end of the day, there is something else to be gained from that, and that is customer trust, that is stakeholder trust and buy-in. And you know, maybe it's a bit boring, but from a compliance perspective, it's really minimizing risk. And I think the biggest shift for me in my career to date is the move away from, well, regulation, SOX, SSA 16, financial audit, new primary legislation that's coming says you have to do this. That's obviously still there, but I think we've matured a lot since then.
I think, yeah, from that point, you know, early on when first legislation started, or you know, standards started coming out, they were very prescriptive. You will do this. I know within government, you know, the information assurance standards, you know, they were all, you must do this, you will have antivirus, you will have firewalls, you will blah blah blah, and it was very black and white. And it wasn't until later that people started to push back, and you started opening up then to saying, okay, well, maybe we need to take a risk balanced approach to this. But I think we've, you know, it's been a long road to get from there to where we are now.
I think they were very, I felt it was very structured and it wasn't expansive. And yes, it was risk-based, but if I just to hone in on one topic or an internal audit, I would say that that's something I saw evolve. Quite simply put, it was very, very much audit definition docs and risk control matrix, but now it's moved to more continuous audit, actually where the auditor is working with the departments and projects as they go through their life cycle. So it's like the second and third line defense have evolved with compliance itself and the moves in industry. I think it's causing a lot of positive benefits actually to the stakeholder, because I think there was a lot of distrust, I would say, with internal audit. Remember when I moved from second to third line, someone might have walked across the road, but now it's becoming a more positive relationship between both parties because they're collaborating as they go through the journey. With Sarbanes-Oxley, I think even flipping back to that, Conor, that was like the security controls and change controls that were being done were very basic. Whereas I think that's evolved now to being far more complex and actually getting to the root of the risk.
Yep.
That's kind of the point I wanted to get across.
I think fundamentally you've stumbled on the difference, I would suggest, which is compliance was stood up as a means of enforcing a set of rules, and it was very sort of, for want of a better term, dictatorial. It was like, you, as you said, you will do this, you will implement this control. The change control is very simplistic, but it's step A, do this, step B, do that, step C, do this. And then it was the check. Did you do that? Tick. Did you do step B? Tick. Did you do step C? Tick. Or control failure, right? And it was like one or done. Like if you failed that control, you failed that control. The concept of risk wasn't necessarily there. It was enforcing a set of rules. And I think the biggest change since that sort of advent of compliance by, diktat was to now has been the transformation of it from a checkbox exercise on the basis of rules to a strategic imperative on the basis of risk, and it becoming much more valuable through collaboration, through cooperation, through internal stakeholder engagement, and also external stakeholder validation, that compliance is there not to find that somebody didn't do their job right. And I know, like speaking from experience as an external auditor, as an externally appointed internal auditor, when you're sitting down with somebody, well, oh, that's not my job. Are you here to tell me that I didn't do my job right because I didn't take a screenshot, or I didn't have this piece of evidence, to satisfy an audit? And it's not like compliance and audit aren't there to just get people to do more work, right? They're fundamental elements that need to be baked into how people's jobs are actually designed, delivered, and executed, and how we actually manage our businesses today.
You put a point across there about the control. It was like point in time, just test it. I think the key difference for me, again, to push into the internal audit element / external, it doesn't really matter. For me, it's the difference between a good auditor and a bad auditor is around substantiating the risk. And I think the concept of substantive testing, it's like if you find something that's not compliant, right? Someone might walk away because the design is not good. A really, really thorough auditor actually does moves to the operation effectiveness testing to substantiate the level of the risk and to see if it's not just an exceptional occurrence.
Yeah, I think that's really what's behind a lot of those changes. I think is that people are trying to get away from that checklist. As much as that's great, I remember in my days as a developer, just tell me what I need to do and I'll do it. And now the new laws tend to be more around, well, you need to think about it and make a choice, and that people don't like that. They want to know, give me an answer, and it's often a lot of something you need to work through versus that was just there. So break a little bit more into the drivers behind that. So Scotty, you were talking a little bit about Enron and that kind of stuff. So how do you think that impacted that evolution?
Yeah, what are the key drivers for really what's actually changing it? One of the bigger parts of my career was around working in the bank in 2008 and just watching it fall apart, not the bank, but the market. And it was quite intriguing to watch. I remember particularly the share price was dropping daily and everyone was just hanging on, and it was dropping. And then I remember the CEO of AIB invested about 100 grand to even kind of put strength back in the market to kind of things are okay here. But in 2008 onwards, when that crash happened, really it became very clear that the regulators, I don't know if they were asleep at the wheel is the correct term, but they may not have had the understanding or skill set of what was actually going on and what was required. So the real thing for me is what's a driver is the crash itself shone a light, I think, on the problems that were there. And central banks, whether it be Ireland Central Bank, UK Central Bank, European Central Bank, I think they really, really stepped up over the next couple of years and worked together. And I had many interactions. I went back into banking, actually. I'd left BSI at a point, and I had a lot of interactions with the European Central Bank and vice versa. But the strictness and the way they operate for me elevated. It was like, I want you to do this and I want you to do it now. And I remember we would have gone back and said, well, we don't have enough resources. It was like, you need to do this and you need to do it now. It was very instructive. You weren't getting away with it. And the breadth and scope you had to go to and the detail you had to go to in your testing, it elevated. And what I always enjoyed around that style of audit is actually it was completely risk-based and it wasn't prescribed. But I do think that there's a massive, massive requirement to both utilize prescribed standards and frameworks as well as go from a risk-based approach. And a little topic, actually, what I've seen happen as well, a driver in the area, which I suppose worked in parallel to all these regulatory upgrades and actually just even industry taking account, whether it be financial or whatever it might be, they all stepped up. They started employing more people with specific skill sets. But that was born out of college courses becoming, I suppose, more sophisticated in nature. Whereas what I'd mentioned earlier before I got cut off was when I was in college, there was one topic in security. Now you're getting very, very tailored, specific security and forensic degrees or masters or whatever it is. So it's kind of like since then, for me, my personal experience since 2008, the world has evolved in line with what's going on. To Paul's point earlier, when he was talking about started physical, now we're in a very digital space, digital world, right? So I believe everything is maneuvering because of the complexity of the environment we're playing in.
I think just to add one small point to that, Scotty, I think one of the additional complexities in that environment, and maybe not to oversell it, but is the technology infrastructure that people are relying on, the technology advancements that we've seen since, you know, the 2008 crash, since the Enron crash, and regulators' responses to those has recognized that organizations need to take account of that technology change because their environments are no longer the same. Their infrastructure is not necessarily in-house. They have a significant physical and indeed digital supply chain today, whether, you know, and some of their key operational processes, their key revenue drivers are all undertaken on an outsourced basis. They may have outsourced the infrastructure, they may have outsourced antivirus, they may have outsourced the entire process to service organizations as well. And regulators realize, well, actually, this requires scrutiny, but actually it also requires accountability. And that was one of the points I was going to make in terms of the overall evolution, is that from that checkbox exercise, you know, that from whence we started with compliance, the governance of compliance and the accountability requirements of compliance have been elevated significantly. And one of those key recognitions within the overall governance of compliance is how do you manage compliance with requirements, regulatory, legal, whatever they might be, when you have a third party delivering for you, or you have a third party supporting the delivery of a key operational process, a key revenue driver, a key financial control, and in there that ultimately you are accountable for, and but you've no visibility of. And I think you're all going to guess what's on the tip of my tongue: due diligence. Due diligence prior to engaging a third party, then monitoring and oversight of that third party during the engagement of them and the contract life cycle, and then managing the offboarding of them as well, and giving your internal and again external stakeholders assurances that you're managing the risks as they relate to that third party. And that obviously has its origins in SOX as well, and you know, attestation reports, SSAE 16, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 reports, all those lovely things.
Well, Conor, can I just say to that part there specifically, like if you can consider it that all the stuff that's coming out there more recently, look at the NIST 2 directive, look at DORA, like, and actually even NIST CSF, that the framework, all of, to your exact point, every one of those focuses on the supply chain and third party more specifically, because actually I want to even ask you a question, Con, like, so go back to when you started your career, as you'd mentioned earlier, like, do you think there was the same level of knowledge there by you know, standards bodies, by framework builders, by regulators to actually know what they needed to cover? Like, are they all just learning as they go along and then evolving all these standards and frameworks? you know?
The obvious answer to that question is no, they didn't, right? But much like the running joke in consulting is you just need to be one step ahead of the client. Regulators needed to be one step ahead of the consultants, or say one page ahead of them in the book, in the textbook. The issue has been, I know it's not a single issue, right? But I think one of the biggest issues in all of this space has been technological advancement, and how quickly technologies have rendered, not quite useless, but and not quite irrelevant, but really done down the old ways of doing things, such as compliance checklists, right? Because nowadays, and there's a really interesting question that I just see popping up in the chat there, in terms of how do we envisage incorporating emerging technologies like AI into the strategy and managing things like ethical standards and privacy. Technology development is not going to stop, and compliance has to keep up with it. Regulators have to keep up with it. Internal auditors and internal compliance functions have to keep up with it, because the environment, the landscape within which we operate is always going to evolve. Like 2018, the GDPR came on the scene, right, with a big bang, and there was a race to be, quote unquote, compliant with the GDPR by the 25th of May 2018.
It was a race.
That's not a one and done thing. Oh, it was an absolute race. I remember leading implementation programs at the time, and boards getting up in arms about how many of the articles of the GDPR they were going to be not compliant with on the 25th of May. And we were like, well, actually, that's not, like, the 25th of May is not the end date. It's actually the starting point of enforcement in 2018. And in fairness, like, some people got it, some people didn't, and the compliance needs to be this business as usual operational capacity within the organization today. And you've alluded to it already: continuous compliance, right? Proactive compliance, continuous auditing, because it's not a one and done thing. Our standards colleagues won't thank me in the assurance function of BSI when I say an ISO 27001 cert. Goodness, the new standard, ISO 42001 for management of AI management systems. That ISO 42001 certificate, when the first one globally is issued, genuinely is very useful on that day. But unless you've got proactive management of the compliance requirements every day after that, and to satisfy the surveillance audits that would follow, it's not going to be good enough, because there could be something that could happen. And compliance isn't about managing the what ifs, it's about being proactive to make sure that you can do as much as you can to manage the risks, the impact and likelihood of the what ifs from occurring, and then minimizing the impact of them when they do occur. So all of that considered, do the regulators and the framework makers have all the answers? No, they don't.
No.
But it's a collaborative approach, and technology will evolve. AI is having its moment, and will continue to be a big player and have a big impact, I think, on the compliance frameworks that we're trying to implement, trying to manage. And I think as compliance professionals today, whether you're in-house or external, I think the onus is on us all to keep up to date and to recognize the potential that these new technologies bring to the table, both on the positive and negative side, because I'm a big advocate of looking at risk in both the positive and negative sense. And critically for me, I think listening to customers, listening to what customers want, what they need, what assurances they need to gather, and how you can build that into things like proactive due diligence programs and proactive risk management approaches is not the answer, but an answer to that complexity.
I think quite often we are on the back foot with compliance and the evolution, the way it comes along, because new things, new attacks happen, AI comes along, someone finally realizes that data protection is important, so let's have GDPR. And then everybody tries to catch up on that. I can remember way back when Configure virus broke out, everybody was exchanging data with USB sticks, and that had a huge, great effect. So I can remember there was aircraft in the Royal Air Force that were grounded because the information they used to take out on bricks to the aircraft, the machines that were feeding them were all infected. I think 2 Navy ships were completely isolated in the ocean because of the virus. The whole French Air Force was grounded. It had such an impact just because, we didn't have the proper controls in place to look after our new USB sticks that everybody was swapping around. So, and I think you know, we play catch up, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. It's like the NIST directive, you know, the Network for Information Security directive that's sort of was implemented. Obviously, it came out, it was, you know, across the member states in Europe trying to enforce this, make it happen. It was inconsistent. Different states picked it up in little pieces. You know, it didn't really fit. So I think, you know, as the threat grew and, you know, the cyber attacks, you know, became more prevalent, I think they obviously, you know, had to beef it up. So when they brought out NIST 2, there was a lot more strengthening of the requirements, addressing the supply chain, which, you know, obviously everybody's understood as being one of the real problems within the industry at the moment. If your standards are great but your supply chain isn't, then you're going to have problems.
True.
Streamlining the reporting, I think NIST 2 is really good at the moment, the way it's being rolled out, and the fact that if you have a problem, you know, your customers must be able to report problems with you, vulnerabilities, but then also you must be able to report those vulnerabilities to the member states so you can protect your country from attacks that are happening within your critical national infrastructure or your supporting environments. So I think that, you know, we're very much reactive as well on how we evolve into these new spaces. So I think it's certainly fascinating the way it jumps and leaps.
It'll be interesting, Paul, to see, will the enforcement of NIST 2 be at a more, I don't know, will it be done better effectively? Let the jury's out. We'll wait and see.
Yeah, because I think the member states have until October this year to put it into law.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I think because the fines are so much greater, and, you know, people are more accountable, I think it's going to go down the same road as GDPR.
Yeah.
And I was at the Cyber UK conference a couple of weeks ago, and the commissioner for the ICO stood up and he was saying that when they go to investigate breaches in data protection and things like that, most of the things they find when they go to these organizations is they have no certifications, they're not certified against anything, or if they've engaged professionals to help them, the professionals that have come in to help them aren't certified bodies and don't follow statutory measures. So it was really interested in hearing him go through those various elements, saying that, you know, the importance of certification, that I think, you know, I think as any professional, you're trying to drive
a position, Paul. That's what
it is. That's correct. Yeah.
Like we said in previous webinars as well, it's like the bottom line, how I tend to operate personally is, no matter what, the day something inevitably does happen, I've got a defensible position that I'm very comfortable talking to a regulator. I've got a framework in place that helps mitigate the likelihood of something happening and the impact when it happens.
And you're absolutely right. And I think that the approach that organizations need to be aware now is that compliance isn't one person's responsibility. It isn't one function's responsibility. It extends beyond just legal requirements and all the regulatory stuff we've talked about, because now it actually should and ought to encompass things like ethical considerations. Is this the right thing to do as an enterprise? Not just because the law says doesn't forbid it, or the regulators aren't looking for a particular, you know, canary in a coal mine kind of a thing, but actually you need to encompass things like ethical considerations, and that's mentioned, I think, somewhere there in the chat as well at the moment. Stakeholders, trust, and that's stakeholders internally and external. I mean, the title of the topic talks about digital trust, and I think that's very relevant across every industry today. And then the other thing, which don't think we've touched on yet, is societal impact. So the impact to wider society that the commercial decisions, technological decisions, or otherwise will or won't have. And I'm just minded of one particular update to the very, very well recognized ISO IEC 27001 that has been made recently as well, to include climate change as a particular element that organizations need to take account for when they're determining how to manage their information security risk. Now, up until now, climate and indeed, look, climate change is a very real issue that organizations and governments, countries all over the world are grappling with. But to see it being introduced as a consideration within the compliance framework required to certify to and then maintain certification against the world's leading information security standard is fantastic, because it's not just about, compliance isn't just about avoiding penalties anymore or avoiding regulatory scrutiny. It's actually about building trust with customers, with people, with society, and maintaining that positive reputation insofar as you possibly can within that landscape, as you mentioned, Scotty, of something will go wrong, something might, eventually. So how are we best prepared for that moment, right? And the old cliched adage, it's not a question of if but when. I'm beyond that at this point. It's like, what will you do when it happens, and how much work have you done in advance, and how ready are you to respond? And compliance can really assist in that readiness, because it's proactive, as opposed to that checkbox reactive after the fact approach that we're probably all very, very familiar with. I think technology and regulatory improvement and advancement, I think we have a lot to thank both technology and regulators for their changes and the impact that it's had in that approach.
Yeah, so speaking of those regulatory changes, I guess, can we hone in a little bit more on what some of those main changes are? So Paul, I guess maybe you can start a little bit with some of the changes made to some of the ISO.
Yeah, I think I'm conscious of time, so I'll just quickly rattle through the, I think back in 1995, obviously when Java first came out, PlayStation was released and Windows 95 rolled out. We had British Standards 7799 from BSI, which obviously evolved over the times. They called Part 1. It evolved over times and was quite prescriptive, what we were talking for before. So it was trying to bridge that initial gap of getting everybody to think about security. Over time, that then broke down into ISO 27002, 27001, and 27005 for the risk management elements of it. Moving on, we're now getting to where we're starting to break it down even more and encompass everything that is changing in our environments. So trying to keep pace with the supplier frameworks and the threats from suppliers. Also looking at improved operability on how we gauge all the information and communicate those threats with sort of like member states, similar to the NIST 2 directive. So I think there's a lot there now in the 2022 edition, now that we're consolidating some of the controls and focusing on what people really should be concerned about. We're a lot more lean, we're a lot more quick at looking on what we need to do. So I think we're constantly evolving, pulling in sort of AI and everything else that we need to worry about. And it's a continual process, but I think we are getting better at that process and how that process looks along all the different standards. They're all formatted in the same way. So, you're good at one, you can easily sort of move into some of the others like 9001 and 27005. They're not big leaps anymore. They're all driving for the same opportunities.
Commonality between,
Yeah.
Yeah, Scotty, can you talk about some of the other sorts of changes that you've seen around NIST and PCI, things like that?
Yeah. So like NIST, a couple of these, like I'm a former QSA myself, so don't claim to be an expert anymore, but I keep up on trend with it. Generally, as you see PCI standards, they iteratively are updated, but there's always like three main changes, like evolution of requirements, so new requirements that come in. If memory serves, I believe there's 64 new requirements in PCI version 4, which I think is super, actually, because it's while it's quite prescriptive, there's always areas that are a little gray. So they obviously create new requirements depending on what's going on in the world and to further protect payment card information. But I love the part that they clarify the guidance. So that's where you can actually look at the intent of the control. What are you actually trying to do here by testing this? And I think that's where you're trying to take away the subjectivity or the assumption of what someone might interpret it to be. And then also they also move and change the structure and format over time. Of the 64 that are coming in, you've got 13 that are absolutely have to happen immediately, and then 51 that are considered best practice. I think it's till into 2025. So you've time actually yourself as an organization to evolve in line with the standard. They're very pragmatic to not go big bang. And I think that's very, very smart. So it's like, and the 13 that actually have to be put in are not that overly complex. They relate to kind of defining your scope and the like, and roles and responsibilities, which I think should have been in place anyway. With NIST CSF framework, I love personally. 1.1 related a lot to national critical infrastructure. The kind of one of the key changes for me is the revamp has really broadened it to all industries, and I think that's really, really good. There's 4 key changes really. They've revamped respond and recover, and I think that goes under the radar a lot. Something to take away. Respond and recover are critical for all organizations for resilience. And resilience is bedded into DORA, to NIS2, to everything now. It's like the new hot topic in regulation. So I really do think CSF is exceptionally good, I suppose, as the chosen framework for NIS2 compliance anyway. So secondly, they introduced a new-ish function, I would say, called govern. Govern already existed, but it was spread among the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. But they've given it its own function area now, which I feel is quite smart. And it helps non-techie people kind of understand the framework a bit more and the impact of it. They have, more going back to Conor's point, they have focused heavily on supply chain or supply chain risk management and third-party management of risk relating to how you interact with suppliers. And as I'd mentioned previously, it was the expanded industry scope. It's not just for national critical infrastructure, it's for all. And it's a real maturity-based framework. So I would urge people to look into that in a little bit more detail, but it's a very, very powerful thing to align yourself with.
That's just some of the changes that we're seeing at the moment, right? Because and Craig, I think probably for you and many of our colleagues in the world of data protection and privacy, you know, we've already mentioned the GDPR, for instance, back in 2018. Not that it was a revolution by any imagination. You know, data protection law existed in Europe. It was definitely an evolution in terms of the regulatory enforcement and some of the accountability measures, but it spurned and maybe kickstarted a change internationally and around the world with additional privacy laws coming to the fore, but very heavily influenced by EU law, such as the GDPR. And we've seen significant fines there for particular practices relating to, you know, use of customer data, transparency. And I think an awful lot of that is being reflected in those other changes that we might be seeing at the moment. Obviously, the EU AI Act is the big regulatory development in Europe, the one outside of maybe DORA, NIS2. Let's face it, the EU does regulation very well, right? Says here's a bunch of stuff you need to comply with, right? But the EU AI Act is obviously very much front and center at the moment. You know, it is going to sort of, it's akin to the GDPR, imposes requirements on companies that are designing and using AI within the EU. It's the first real fundamental comprehensive piece of regulation for modern AI, because again, like data protection, like AI has been around for a very long time. AI isn't a new thing. Generative AI and its application in that sense might be novel for, you know, you and me and many others, but AI in and of itself is not very new. But the AI regulation is going to impose very significant GDPR-esque type fines and sanctions relating to global turnover, particularly for prohibited AI systems, such as those that use manipulative techniques or misuse of biometric data. And I think compliance will need to evolve significantly to be able to apply typical compliance practices, and analyzing their existing practices, what gaps have we got against that regulation, and how do we operationalize then the necessary steps to achieve compliance, not as a tick box exercise, but in a process-based, risk-based approach as well, because the EU Act places firmly on regulatory footing the requirement to have a risk management process for AI and indeed a management system for AI, which leads me on to the other regulatory development, or rather sort of compliance development in that space, which, and I've mentioned it already, unfortunately, as well, ISO 42001, which was introduced in December of last year, an international management system to address the governance of AI. And for me, that is a big compliance issue, with its primary goal to promote the responsible development, deployment, and operation of AI technologies. Anybody around the world can obviously use that to manage risks inherent in AI. It's a systematic approach built along the same framework as any other ISO. And it aligns with existing and other management systems that organizations might have, where there may already be compliance programs stood up to assess compliance and monitor compliance as well. But really, really quickly, I just wanted to sort of maybe highlight how both of those, in conjunction with what Scotty and Paul have already alluded to, how taken together, organizations' approach to compliance may be impacted and may need to change. We talked about the strategic alignment. Specifically, we mentioned risk management ad nauseum almost at this point, because I think fundamentally risk is at the core of, should be at the core of compliance programs, and accountability and transparency, two very fundamental privacy concepts, and indeed good business practices, shall we say, but also need to be acutely developed, honed, and focused on from a compliance perspective going forward. Ethical considerations, I think, are massive as well. But then for me, from a compliance perspective, I think organizations need to figure out how do they operationalize compliance in this new compliance world that we live within. Strategic alignment is important, the ethical considerations baked into it, but how do we operationalize compliance in this AI era, or the era of digital trust? To be not always on. Sorry, Scotty, one final point. Not always on, but that continuous compliance approach, because I think without the realization that it is a continuous effort in the face of this evolving landscape, we could be in trouble. Sorry, Scotty.
No, it's just, you struck actually, because what you're saying is spot on, right? And it's linked to one of the questions, Craig, that came in. It's like, and again, you're semi-answering it already. So how should we position ourselves for the upcoming changes as a result of the evolution of compliance, right?
Yeah, so, it's about proactivity.
It is, right. And it kind of, the reason I wanted to kind of link it into what you were saying is, if you look at our previous webinar around breach resilience as well, right? I would suggest that it's about mapping out what your business requirements are, looking at your ecosystem, looking at your competitors, looking at your compliance requirements, and effectively building a comprehensive framework to determine your current state and where you are right now. So you have a really transparent view of where you currently stand, but understanding what the roadmap is to compliance. And that needs to be specifically tailored to what you need to do as a business, regardless of whether it's regulation or not. And I think that's it's a good link back to our previous webinar. To, if you haven't listened to it, we give you a structured framework of actually how to manage that roadmap or journey to compliance. And it goes into great depth. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks for getting that answer in there. I think that really does. And then the other point, and Conor, I think you addressed that a little bit as well. One of the other questions came in around, with the use of AI, how does that then work in terms of compliance? And that, do you get somebody that still takes responsibility for that? If it's something that's left to the AI to manage compliance, who at the end of the day, takes that responsibility?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think fundamentally the buck stops at the board, the highest level of management, right? And they need to be informed. And again, back to how do we keep up to date with all this, not just as regulators or as framework developers, but actually as a board. And the board is charged with managing risk. As simple as that, managing the risk to the business, whether that's through the audit committee, the risk committee. They've got the external auditors come in to do financial audit. There's an internal audit function, and there might be a risk and compliance function. And I think fundamentally, the compliance function needs to be arming itself with enough knowledge to be able to embrace the era of AI and also highlight the risks relating to its, the shadow IT effect of AI and the shadow AI usage within the organization, and proactively address it rather than just shove it under the carpet and forget about it. And I think whether that's through the chief compliance officer, through the head of the functional head of risk, enterprise risk, AI needs to be captured as a risk and needs to be treated as a risk, defining a formal policy for it. I think compliance can have a very, very strong voice in the room there. And whether it's relying on internal legal, internal data protection and privacy, whether it's internal information security, or in actual fact, it's going to be a collection of all of those with compliance and risk in the room as well. So for me, I think how compliance can address that is through that proactive escalation of compliance risk via existing mechanisms. And if there isn't an existing mechanism and there's no compliance function, well, then anybody who's involved in compliance-esque activities, internal audit, risk needs to be highlighting this to the board to give direction. It is a board issue without any doubt in my mind.
Yeah, and if I can just add, that board issue, I know in NIST too it says it, and I know in UK government they've rolled out the importance of having a cyber champion on the board, someone that doesn't need to know the in-depth knowledge but needs to champion cybersecurity for the organization. It's paramount for being able to get that message across, seeing what's out there, talking to the experts to be able to communicate that to the rest of the board so that everybody understands.
That's very important.
And this time has absolutely flown by. So I think we are out of time. So I think the going without slides, I think I would count that as a success. So just hope everybody joining me in thanking Conor, Scotty, and Paul for joining us today. This was a fantastic discussion. And thank you so much.